32 wars and conflicts raging, and human security threatened all over the world.
Nuclear weapons, mass atrocities, genocide,
the climate change,
recession and pandemic flu,
d'une catastrophe planétaire.
With the United Nations divided and ineffective,
the United Nations will continue to be a weak organization.
And developing nations demanding their share of power,
Africa needs to be there.
The world looks to us.
We ask, will the United Nations Security Council live up to its name? This is Empire. Hello and welcome to Empire. I am Marwan Bishara. More than 100 heads of states met here in New York to open the 64th session of the United Nations amid mounting doubts about its capacity to tackle challenges of the 21st century. For 6 decades, the executive body of the United Nations, its Security Council, has been either paralyzed by East-West divide or exploited by its powerful permanent members to advance their own geopolitical agendas. Despite the Security Council's commitment to international peace and security, 185 wars have ravaged the world since its inception, of which 32 remain open wounds. Meanwhile, pressing global challenges, including the proliferation of nuclear weapons and climate change, have compounded the UN's responsibilities. Over the next hour, I will review attempts at reforming the Security Council and expand its mandate with Louise Arbour, the head of the International Crisis Group and former head of the UN Human Rights Commission, and India's UN Ambassador Hardeep Singh Puri, as well as Boutros Ghali, former UN Secretary General, James Straub, author of The Best Intentions, Kofi Annan, the UN in an Era of American World Power, and Steve Clemons, Director of the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation. But first, a short history of the world's organization.
It began with such high hopes. In 1945, 50 countries gathered in San Francisco to forge a new United Nations organization from the ashes of the Second World War.
The vote unanimous, adopting the Charter of the United Nations.
But behind the scenes, the victors of World War II had already seized control. America, Russia, Britain, China and France created a parallel and all-powerful Security Council.
It was the Great Powers Club who would manage and be responsible for international peace and security.
Only they could order international military action, and they alone had the power to veto resolutions in the Council.
There was a sense that world security needs great powers to keep order in a troubled and dangerous world.
The time for action is here now.
And we will be those powers.
In return, the Big Five great powers promised to use the veto only as a weapon of last resort. It would prove a hollow promise.
There were long periods in the Security Council's history where decisions were simply stopped by the veto.
Throughout the Cold War, the Big Five invoked their vetoes in Eastern Europe, Latin America, wherever their own strategic interests were threatened. And the Security Council's legitimacy crumbled as it repeatedly failed to protect smaller countries from the predations of its permanent superpower members.
When there's a dispute between a large power and a small power, the small power tends to disappear. And when there's a dispute between two large powers, the Security Council tends to disappear.
But after the Cold War ended, the Security Council re-emerged, authorizing the use of force against Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. Victory in that first Gulf War resurrected belief in the UN's abilities.
There was a very strong feeling after the first Gulf War, almost of euphoria. that somehow the United Nations had returned and that it could do all the things that it had been prevented from doing during the Cold War.
The Security Council sent peacekeeping forces to safeguard civilians during the civil wars in Bosnia and Rwanda. But its bright new optimism died as thousands of men, women and children were raped, maimed or murdered, and UN soldiers did nothing to protect them.
On behalf of the members of the Security Council, I would like to express profound sorrow.
The UN was put in a situation of shame by both Rwanda and Bosnia, because in both cases there were UN peacekeeping forces present at a time when terrible things were happening, and they did not act to stop those terrible things.
After September 2001, Washington saw the Security Council's job as, at best, to rubber stamp its wars of revenge. So when the Council failed to back its invasion of Iraq, the US simply ignored it.
The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us.
It's a very, very dangerous game you have to play as a great power. Because if you see yourself drawing benefit from the Council, you can't see its legitimacy resources continually depleted.
At the final session of the San Francisco Conference.
In 1945, the UN Security Council was charged with safeguarding international peace.
Let us not fail to grasp this supreme chance.
65 years on, can a Security Council still controlled by the tarnished victors of World War II ever restore the ideals and hopes of its creators?
To create an enduring peace under the guidance of God.
Madame Arbour, you are the head of the International Crisis Group. You're a former prosecutor of crime wars. From your perspective, do you think the disparities of power at the UN Security Council are a hindrance, or they are a necessity for the implementation of international law?
The conventional wisdom is that the Security Council, as presently constituted with its present working methods, is somewhat dysfunctional, or in any event has lost a considerable base of legitimacy, and as a consequence has lost influence and power. It's a body, it's really the only body in the United Nations that has coercive powers. But you know, compliance is much better than coercion. It's much better to get people to do what they should do, what you want them to do, than to try to employ what, in any event, are very limited methods of coercion.
But what about, Ambassador Puri, the power of veto at the Security Council? The fact that there are a few powerful who can basically put a limit to the will of the international community, or empower the will of the international community?
Well, let's situate the coming into existence of the United Nations and the Security Council, which is the most empowered of all its organs. Yes. The purpose was to avoid another war on such a scale.
The Second World War.
The Second World War. Now, nearly 50 million or more people lost their lives in the Second World War. That is the context in which the United Nations was created after the experience of the League of Nations. And that is the context, the mindset in which there were permanent members wielding veto power. Now, the use of the veto, rather the existence and subsequent use of the veto, has been criticized by many people. Why? Because the veto has been used in the 6 decades or more of its existence, not to come to the defense of the weak and those who don't have the power, but very often to serve narrow national or sectarian interests. And the veto has been used, for instance, to block the membership of countries aspiring to join the United Nations. Do we need the veto? That will require a separate discussion. We certainly need an improvement in the working methods of the Security Council and the way it is structured.
there's much more talk and action on retribution and use of force and sanctions, but very little in terms of preventive action. Do you think the United Nations, from your experience, is at all set up to prevent conflicts or to manage conflicts as it should?
I believe the institutional mechanisms, both within the United Nations system and outside, are there in order to prevent conflict, the outbreak of conflict. Do we have the political will to use the existing mechanisms? That would be the case in an ideal world. People don't stop committing violations or doing things which they are not supposed to do just because they are not supposed to do them. That is what human nature is all about. But I think we need a balance. We need a balance between prevention and I don't think the retributive power, as you describe it, can be totally absent.
Yes.
I think in a sense we have to be very clear that the exercise of the veto in the 50 years, 60 years of existence of the Security Council was not really a betrayal of the reason why the veto was granted in the first place. I don't think the veto was anchored in an idea of the protection of a kind of international public interest. The veto was anchored in the powerful nations asserting for themselves a very powerful tool to protect their own national interest. And you know what? That's exactly what they've done. So in that sense, I don't think it's a perversion of the process. Now that there's a debate whether others should join this permanent club and whether others should have a veto, I think the important thing to understand is that the fact that the veto was granted to some was a reflection, of course, of their power to acquire that tool. But then the veto itself becomes a tool of power. And with the passage of time, we're now facing an institution that is no longer responsive to the kinds of catastrophic conflicts that take millions of human lives, but that are of a completely different nature.
How about from your experience, once again, as a former Supreme Court Justice? What happens when all of them agree and they act, according to some, illegally? For example, when they applied sanctions to Iraq in the 1990s, leading to the death of hundreds of thousands, among them many, many, many children.
Well, the Security Council is the quintessential political body. Frankly, I don't think a discussion about the legality of action by the Security Council is all that pertinent. At the end of the day, it's an exercise of political power.
It's the geopolitics that rule in the world, not presumably the value of power, rather than the power of the values of this institution?
I think it's part of the crisis of legitimacy of the Council itself, this appetite now that we see more and more for legal order, for the rule of law, both domestically and internationally, for an environment that is less political and more guided by adherence to law.
Ambassador Puri, at one point the world or the Security Council was divided on East-West ideology and superpower interest. Today it looks like the North-South divide is resurfacing. And while the North and the developed world is emphasizing the questions of international security, the developing world, the South, is emphasizing the question of human security, the socioeconomic rights of people around the world. And you see there's a way out of this contradiction.
I'm no longer sure that those divisions come either on ideological lines or they come on development issues versus international security issues. The point is that the Security Council has the capacity to take up any issue that it wants to. For instance, today it's looking at issues relating to climate change because the small island states feel that issues relating to climate threaten their very existence. That's enough for the issue to go there. Now, it's an asymmetrical situation. Do the people who are sitting in the Security Council, who were part of a 1945 model automobile, in 2010, is it legitimate for them to be determining the roadmap and what is there? I am not suggesting some of them should come off it. But in order for the Security Council to have legitimacy, for it to have credibility, for it to be effective, you need an expansion of both the permanent and non-permanent members to reflect the reality which exists in 2010. Is anyone serious when he or she suggests that this kind of an organ has acceptability or credibility? No.
I want to get to some specific examples. But before we do that, we're going to watch a report by Stephen Cole, a kind of a balance sheet on the successes and the failures of the United Nations Security Council. Let's watch.
Can anyone claim that the introduction of long-range nuclear missiles into Cuba strengthens the peace?
It's been a place of history.
Leaving Saddam Hussein in possession of weapons of mass destruction is not an option.
And histrionics.
As such,
Say I apologize here. Let me see. Say I apologize.
Why should I waste my time here in the Security Council?
But what has the United Nations Security Council actually achieved? Since its inception in 1946, the UN's stated objective was to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Grand ideals, but since then, there have been 185 wars. 32 conflicts are still raging today, and 80,000 UN peacekeepers are trying to contain them. The UN Security Council issues hundreds of resolutions, often on the same subjects, noting, guiding, urging, requesting, reaffirming, reiterating, year after year. The only tools that the UN Security Council have to wield are either sanctions,
to get sanctions passed,
Desanction.
crippling sanctions,
or force. Both these weapons were tried but failed to topple Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. At times it seems that nothing the Security Council does has any real effect. Another area the Security Council is supposed to police is nuclear weapons. The 5 permanent members all have nuclear weapons. It's an elite club, and they're determined no one else will join. Yet, that didn't stop India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel from also developing their bombs. And Iran is violating UN safeguards in building a concealed nuclear facility to produce weapons-grade uranium. All despite the UN Security Council's best efforts to stop them. Supporters of the United Nations say that without it, the Cold War would have ended in nuclear Armageddon. And dozens of other wars could have happened. But then again, success is hard to define. Is the perpetual stalemate in Cyprus, for example, between Greece and Turkey, a success? The Korean Peninsula has been divided by a so-called demilitarized zone for more than 50 years. Is that too a success? Besides, what can the world's policemen hope to achieve if the UN's budget, including all peacekeeping operations, is only $10 billion? And that's less than half what New York City alone spends on education.
The Secretariat building in New York has 38 stories. If you lost 10 stories today, it wouldn't make a bit of difference.
So while the critics snipe,
there is no United Nations.
Perhaps we should adjust our lofty ideals and reflect on what the second UN Secretary General said. The UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save it from hell.
Madame Arbor, 185 wars over 60 years. That's 3 wars a year. 32 of them are still waged today. On the other hand, we have 1,800 and some UN Security Council resolution. What would you give the United Nations Security Council from 1 to 10, and why?
It's very easy to ridicule these numerous resolutions expressing concern and condemning and so on. But this exercise has, in some cases, tremendous impact in the prevention or the management of brewing conflict. In fact, peace is a process, is a long-term sort of engagement. The fact that the Security Council or the Human Rights Council or the General Assembly or groups of friends, all kinds of methods, the fact that all this engages the international community in remaining focused and attentive on an issue cannot be dismissed as completely insignificant.
But you were, right there and then in the 1990s, very much involved in the question of war crimes. This optimism after the Gulf War, after the end of the Cold War, suddenly was overtaken by pessimism. 4 million civilians were killed, died in those sorts of conflicts in the 1990s. Is it because of indifference of the Security Council members?
The Council doesn't have a shopping list of tools of intervention. it is allowed to be very creative. Its mandate is to protect international peace and security. Traditionally, we've always assumed it has economic means, sanctions, or military means. In 1993, the Council launched, I have to say probably in desperation of the limitations of the other means, created the International Criminal Justice Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. A year later, repeated the exercise in Rwanda, and that took us eventually to a treaty-based international criminal court.
But they were a bit late, right? In Rwanda especially.
And that's why I think we need justice to pre-exist conflict. But I'm pointing that out to show that with a little bit of imagination, you can launch methods that were not in the traditional arsenal of the Council. Have they been very effective up to now? That's another debate. But we could see that the Council is not limited by economic or military tools.
Ambassador Puri, what happens to imagination that Madame Arbour is talking about when it comes to, for example, the question of Palestine? Your nation was founded in 1947. Israel was founded in 1948, and Palestine was unfounded then. And every year we come to the Security Council and we hear this flowery language about Palestinian rights and this and that. What does it say about the United Nations Security Council that there's a conflict that's been going on for 60 years?
Well, first of all, on the issue of Palestine, all of us are in favor of a Palestinian state which can live in dignity along with the state of Israel.
But that doesn't matter.
Let me come to that. Action on this lies with the actors, with the dramatis personae, and they are not all in the Security Council. Certainly, we need forward movement on that. And I think it's no one's case that that issue should not be given the highest priority. It will be. But to compare two situations, one is a country which after 190 years of colonialism, its independence is now the world's leading democracy. Yes, certainly that's an issue we can discuss. Certainly, I think the Palestinian issue raises questions as to how the international community as such is reacting and what needs to be done. I don't think it's a Security Council action in my mind alone.
When it comes to the question of mechanism and what to do about those circumstances, you, Madame Arbour, spoke about the need to prosecute people back in 2006 during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. You didn't specify prosecute who, but anyway, you said there are war crimes and people should be prosecuted. Once again, we have now the Justice Richard Goldstone's report, again about war crimes a year or 2 years later in Gaza. What is the Security Council to do about continuous war crimes?
The Security Council doesn't have the monopoly on conflict prevention, conflict management, and conflict resolution, and I think it's a good thing.
But isn't the UN Security Council's mission and mandate is to maintain international peace and security?
Yeah, but there are times where other actors are better positioned to achieve the same result or to achieve a desirable result without the coercive action of the Security Council, or particularly in cases where the Security Council is completely paralyzed.
What troubles me about this, Madame Arbour, is that in each case of violations of human rights, of violation of international law, of conflict and war and genocide, we are told that this is very special, this is very specific, that the question of Yugoslavia is specific, the question of Georgia is specific, Palestine, the question of Sri Lanka, Darfur, Rwanda, and so on and so forth. But isn't the international law is done in order to be able to apply one measure to all these questions of violations?
Yes, and in fact, we have a very good body of law, the Geneva Conventions, but the question is, if the methodology of warfare, that is essentially what this body of law is about, was used in a fashion that will create also political consequences for a very long time unless they are addressed, that to me is not just a human rights issue. It's the smart political investment in the future.
Let us not invest the Security Council with the all-important role. There are other actors, as Louis says, but more important, there are limits to what the Security Council, as it is presently structured, can do. Therefore, and it's partly a realization of that limitation, that other issues are now going away into smaller groups outside the UN. But I would like to conclude, I think we're much better off with the United Nations being there and the Security Council being there. I don't think there is a correlation between the existence of the Security Council and the number of wars. It's not my case that there is a total failure. No, not at all. Why would I aspire to be a permanent member of the Security Council if I thought the thing was no good? On the other hand, all we are talking about is to make that organ more representative, more effective, for it to have greater credibility.
On this positive note, I'm going to have to end because otherwise we're going to go on to a little more pessimism. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. When
we come back, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, Stephen Clemens, and James Straub will give us their perspective on the future of the United Nations.